Hello everyone and welcome back to English Spark, the place where you can improve your English through exciting and unforgettable stories. Tonight's story is one of the most terrifying urban legends ever told. Some people believe it is only a creepy tale meant to scare children, while others insist it really happened. They all agree on one thing. If someone knocks on your door at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, no matter what you hear, no matter who calls your name, and no matter how desperate they sound, don't answer the door. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and enjoy today's terrifying story. Ethan Brooks had never believed in ghosts, demons, cursed houses, or anything supernatural. At 29 years old, he was the kind of person who laughed whenever someone mentioned haunted places or paranormal investigations. He believed fear existed only because people refused to search for logical explanations. After accepting a new position as a network engineer, Ethan left the crowded city where he had lived his entire life and moved to the quiet town of Black Hollow. The town looked peaceful, surrounded by thick forests, old stone bridges, and narrow streets lined with Victorian houses that seemed frozen in time. It was exactly the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, which was perfect for someone who wanted a peaceful life. The only strange thing Ethan noticed before moving in was how unbelievably cheap his new house was. It was larger than most homes in the neighborhood, recently renovated, and located on a beautiful hill overlooking the town. When he asked the real estate agent why the price was so low, the man hesitated for several seconds before forcing an uncomfortable smile. "People around here are superstitious," he finally said. Ethan laughed. "Let me guess. They think it's haunted." The agent didn't laugh back. Instead, he quietly handed Ethan the house keys and said, "Just remember one thing. If someone knocks at exactly 3 in the morning, don't answer the door." Ethan smiled politely, assuming it was simply an old local joke, then drove to his new home without giving those words another thought. The house itself was beautiful despite its age. Wooden floors creaked beneath every step. Antique furniture filled several rooms, and a massive grandfather clock stood proudly in the entrance hall. During his first few days, Ethan unpacked his belongings, explored the town, and settled into his new routine. Yet something about Black Hollow felt unusual. Every evening just before sunset, people hurried indoors. Restaurants closed much earlier than expected. Children disappeared from playgrounds, and by 10 o'clock the streets were completely empty. One afternoon, Ethan visited the only diner in town. While paying for lunch, the elderly waitress glanced at his address written on the receipt. Her smile instantly faded. "You're living in the Ashcroft house?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. Without saying another word, she reached beneath the counter and handed him a small silver cross attached to a worn leather cord. "Keep this close to you," she said quietly, "and whatever you hear after 3 in the morning, don't answer the door." Ethan thanked her out of politeness, slipped the cross into his pocket, and walked away smiling. By the time he returned home, he had completely forgotten about it. He tossed the cross into a kitchen drawer beside spare batteries and old receipts, convinced the people of Black Hollow simply enjoyed frightening newcomers with ghost stories. Days turned into a week, and nothing unusual happened. Ethan worked remotely during the day, watched movies at night, and enjoyed the peaceful silence surrounding the old house. Occasionally he heard strange creaks in the attic or soft footsteps echoing somewhere upstairs, but he blamed the aging wooden structure. Every old house made noises, especially at night. On the 8th evening after moving in, Heavy rain covered the town while powerful winds rattled the windows. Ethan stayed awake longer than usual, finishing a work project before falling asleep on the living room couch. Hours later, he was suddenly awakened by 3 slow knocks. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was calm, deliberate, and impossibly loud. Half asleep, Ethan looked toward the front door before checking the time on his phone. 3 a.m. He immediately remembered the strange warnings from the real estate agent and the waitress. Smiling to himself, he whispered, "Perfect timing." Curious rather than frightened, he walked toward the entrance. Before opening the door, he looked through the peephole. No one was standing outside. The front porch was completely empty. Rain continued falling heavily, but there wasn't a single person in sight. Ethan frowned. Assuming someone had knocked before running away, he turned around and headed back toward the couch. 3 more knocks echoed through the house. Bang, bang, bang. This time they sounded even slower. Ethan returned to the door and looked through the peephole again. Still nothing. Not even movement in the distance. Feeling slightly annoyed, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. Freezing air rushed inside immediately. The porch was empty. The street was empty. Every neighboring house remained dark. Ethan stepped outside, looking in every direction. "Hello," he called. No answer. Then he noticed something beneath the giant oak tree at the end of his front yard. A little girl stood perfectly still beneath the branches, wearing an old white dress soaked by the rain. Long black hair completely covered her face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. She simply stood there staring toward the house. Ethan felt a strange chill run through his body. "Are you okay?" he shouted. "Are your parents nearby?" The girl didn't answer. Slowly, she raised one thin arm and pointed toward the open front door behind him. Confused, Ethan turned around for only a second to see what she was pointing at. The doorway stood exactly as he had left it. When he looked back toward the tree, the little girl had disappeared. His heart skipped a beat. There was nowhere she could have gone in such a short time. The yard was open, the rain was heavy, and there was no place to hide. Suddenly, 3 slow knocks echoed once more. Bang, bang, bang. Ethan froze as he realized the sound was no longer coming from the front door. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. Ethan remained frozen on the porch for several seconds, unable to understand how knocking could be coming from inside a house he had just left empty. The rain continued pouring over the roof while the front door swayed gently in the cold wind. Every instinct told him to run, get into his car, and leave Black Hollow forever, yet curiosity pulled him back inside. He slowly stepped across the doorway and pushed the front door shut behind him. The instant the lock clicked into place, the entire house became unnaturally silent. Even the sound of the rain disappeared as though the walls themselves had swallowed every noise from the outside world. Ethan stood motionless, listening carefully. Then the knocking returned. Bang, bang, bang. This time it echoed from the second floor. His heartbeat quickened as he grabbed the heavy flashlight resting on a nearby table and cautiously climbed the staircase. Every step creaked beneath his weight, each sound seeming far louder than it should have been. The hallway upstairs was darker than usual, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath became visible. The flashlight flickered once before shining steadily again. 4 bedroom doors lined the hallway. 3 were closed. The 4th, at the very end, stood slightly open even though Ethan clearly remembered closing every door before going to sleep. He slowly approached it, each step feeling heavier than the last. Just before reaching the room, Another sound drifted through the hallway. It was soft, almost too quiet to hear. Someone was humming a lullaby. The melody sounded old, broken, and strangely familiar, as if he had heard it somewhere during childhood. Ethan swallowed hard and gently pushed the bedroom door open. The room was empty. Dust floated through the flashlight beam while an antique rocking chair moved back and forth near the window, creaking rhythmically despite the complete absence of wind. He searched beneath the bed, inside the wardrobe, and behind the curtains. There was no one there. Then the humming stopped. Ethan slowly turned toward the old mirror hanging on the wall. At first he saw only his own frightened reflection. But as he watched, tiny droplets of water began appearing on the glass, forming words one letter at a time as though invisible fingers were writing from the other side. "You should not have opened it." Ethan stepped backward so quickly that he nearly dropped the flashlight. Before he could react, every light in the house exploded into darkness. The flashlight beam flickered violently before dying completely. He was left standing in absolute blackness. A slow giggle echoed somewhere behind him. It sounded exactly like the little girl outside. Ethan spun around, desperately pressing the flashlight switch, but nothing happened. Then he heard tiny barefoot footsteps running through the hallway. They circled him once, twice, then stopped directly behind him. He felt icy breath against the back of his neck. A child's voice whispered softly beside his ear. "You looked outside, and now I can look inside." Ethan shouted and stumbled into the hallway, feeling his way toward the staircase in complete darkness. As he reached the top step, the grandfather clock downstairs suddenly chimed 3 times, even though it had never worked since he moved in. The sound echoed through the house with unnatural force. At that exact moment, every light came back on. Ethan looked downstairs and his blood turned to ice. The front door was standing wide open again. Muddy footprints covered the wooden floor, beginning at the entrance and leading deeper into the house. They were much too small to belong to an adult. Slowly following the footprints with his eyes, Ethan realized they did not stop in the hallway. They continued up the staircase, ending exactly where he was standing. Trembling, he looked down at the floor beneath his own feet. Fresh muddy footprints surrounded him, even though he had never walked outside in the rain long enough to leave them. They looked as though someone much smaller had been standing beside him the entire time. Then another footprint appeared on the floor all by itself. Then another. Then another. One after another, invisible feet began walking away from Ethan, leaving wet, muddy prints across the hallway toward the room at the end. The bedroom door slowly creaked open by itself. Inside the dark room, the rocking chair began moving again. Back and forth. Back and forth. Back and forth. Then Ethan noticed something that made every hair on his body stand up. Sitting in the rocking chair was the little girl. Her long black hair still covered her face, but this time she was holding something in her lap. It was a faded family photograph. She slowly lifted it toward him. Even from the doorway, Ethan recognized the house in the picture. It was the Ashcroft house. A smiling family stood on the porch. A father, a mother, and their young daughter. But standing behind them, almost hidden in the shadows, was the same little girl in the white dress. She had been there all along, unnoticed by the family smiling at the camera. Ethan took one hesitant step backward. The little girl slowly raised her head. For the first time, her hair parted just enough to reveal one completely black eye staring directly into his soul. She smiled, and in a voice that sounded far older than any child, she whispered, "You're part of the picture now." At that exact moment, the photograph in her hands changed. The smiling family disappeared, and Ethan saw himself standing alone on the front porch of the house while the little girl stood directly behind him with one hand resting gently on his shoulder. Ethan stared at the photograph in horror, unable to breathe as the image became clearer with every passing second. It was not an old picture that happened to resemble him. It was him. He recognized the jacket he had been wearing only a few hours earlier, the flashlight still clutched in his hand, and the terrified expression frozen on his face. Behind him, the little girl smiled with those endless black eyes, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as though she had known him forever. Before Ethan could move, the photograph slowly began changing again. A dark shadow appeared standing behind the little girl, far taller than any human being, its shape barely visible through the heavy darkness surrounding it. The figure had no face, only two pale glowing eyes that seemed to stare directly through the photograph and into Ethan himself. The little girl's smile widened as she whispered, "He's finally looking at you." The bedroom door slammed shut with enough force to shake the entire house. Ethan lunged for the handle, desperately trying to pull it open, but it refused to move. The temperature dropped so quickly that frost spread across the windows and walls. His breath turned into thick white clouds while the air became painfully cold. Suddenly, the old rocking chair stopped moving. Silence filled the room. Then the little girl slowly stood up. She was much taller than Ethan remembered seeing outside. Her white dress dragged across the wooden floor, leaving behind dark wet stains that looked nothing like water. She took one slow step toward him, then another. Ethan backed away until his shoulders pressed against the locked door. The flashlight in his trembling hand suddenly flickered back to life. Its beam illuminated the girl's face completely for the first time. Her skin was unnaturally pale and cracked like old porcelain. Her mouth stretched into an impossible smile filled with broken black teeth. And where her eyes should have been there was only endless darkness. Without moving her lips, she spoke directly inside Ethan's mind. "Do you know why everyone tells you not to answer the door?" Ethan couldn't speak. His heart pounded so violently he thought it might burst from his chest. The voice continued, "Because the door was never meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep us in." At that exact moment, the wall behind the little girl began trembling. Deep cracks spread across the faded wallpaper as a loud knocking echoed from inside the wall itself. Bang, bang, bang. Then another section of the wall answered. Bang, bang, bang. Within seconds, every wall in the bedroom was shaking as hundreds of invisible fists pounded from the other side. The wallpaper bulged outward as though countless hands were pressing against it, trying to force their way through. Pale fingers slowly pushed through the cracks, clawing desperately into the room. Ethan screamed and finally managed to force the bedroom door open. He stumbled into the hallway and slammed it shut behind him, but the knocking didn't stop. Instead, it spread throughout the entire house. Every wall, every ceiling, every floorboard. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. It sounded as though hundreds of people had become trapped inside the house itself. Ethan raced downstairs, determined to escape. He grabbed his car keys from the kitchen counter, unlocked the front door, and threw it open. Instead of seeing the front yard, he found himself staring at the upstairs hallway once again. The same hallway he had just run down. Confused, he slammed the door shut and rushed to the back entrance leading into the garden. When he opened it, the exact same hallway appeared once more. Every exit now led back inside the house. Panic overwhelmed him. He grabbed a heavy chair and smashed it through the nearest living room window. Glass exploded across the floor. But beyond the broken frame there was no garden, no street, and no town. There was only endless darkness stretching farther than his eyes could see. From somewhere deep within that darkness came the sound of children laughing, followed by 3 slow knocks echoing through the void. Bang, bang, bang. As Ethan stepped away from the shattered window, the grandfather clock suddenly began ticking for the first time since he had moved into the house. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned toward it. The hands moved backward instead of forward until they stopped at exactly 3 a.m. The clock chimed 3 times. Then every photograph hanging on the walls changed at once. The smiling strangers who had filled the old family portraits were gone. Every frame now showed Ethan standing inside the house. And in each picture, the little girl was standing a little closer to him than before. Ethan's legs nearly gave out beneath him as he stared at the walls covered with photographs that had somehow transformed before his eyes. Every picture captured a different moment from the last 8 days of his life in Black Hollow. One showed him carrying moving boxes into the house on his first day. Another showed him eating dinner alone in the kitchen. A third revealed him sleeping on the living room couch the very night he heard the first knock. He had never seen anyone taking these photographs, yet every detail was perfect. What terrified him most was not seeing himself. It was seeing the little girl. In the earliest picture she stood outside the windows, barely visible in the distance. In the next one she appeared inside the house, hiding in dark corners behind furniture. In the newest photograph she stood only inches behind Ethan, her icy hand resting gently on his shoulder, while he remained completely unaware of her presence. Before he could tear his eyes away, another photograph slowly developed by itself inside an empty frame hanging above the fireplace. The image showed Ethan exactly as he was at that moment, standing frozen in the living room. But something was different. In the photograph he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure with the glowing white eyes now stood directly behind the little girl. It was impossibly tall, its head almost touching the ceiling, and although its face remained hidden inside complete darkness, Ethan could somehow feel it smiling. Suddenly the glass covering every photograph shattered at the same instant. Thousands of tiny fragments rained onto the floor as a deafening chorus of whispers filled the house. Hundreds of voices repeated the same sentence over and over until it became impossible to tell where one voice ended and another began. He opened the door. He opened the door. He opened the door. Ethan covered his ears, but the whispers only grew louder, echoing inside his mind instead of around him. Desperate to escape, he grabbed his backpack, shoved his laptop inside, and ran toward the garage. If the doors refused to work, perhaps he could drive straight through them. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The vehicle roared forward, crashing through the garage door in an explosion of wood and metal. For one brief second Ethan believed he had escaped. Then his headlights illuminated the upstairs hallway of the house. Somehow the car had burst through the garage only to emerge inside the second floor, its front bumper smashing through old furniture as if the impossible had become completely normal. The engine suddenly died. Every electronic system inside the car shut off at once. The radio crackled to life by itself, releasing nothing but soft static. Then beneath the static, a little girl's voice began humming the same haunting lullaby Ethan had heard upstairs. Slowly another voice joined in. Then another. Within seconds dozens of children were humming together through the speakers, their melody growing louder until the windshield cracked from the vibration. Ethan threw open the car door and stumbled into the hallway. The house was changing around him. The wallpaper peeled away by itself, revealing ancient stone walls beneath instead of wood. The ceiling grew higher with every passing second, disappearing into darkness far above. Doors multiplied along the corridor where none had existed before. Some were old and rotten. Others were made of black iron. A few looked brand new. Every one of them bore deep scratch marks as though someone had spent years trying to claw their way out. Then every doorknob slowly began turning by itself. One after another, the doors creaked open. From inside each room came different sounds: crying, laughter, prayers, screams, whispering. Some rooms echoed with complete silence that somehow felt even more terrifying than the others. Ethan backed away until he reached the end of the hallway, where he noticed a single wooden door he had never seen before. Unlike the others, it carried no scratches, no dust, and no signs of age. Only 3 words had been carved into its surface in neat, careful letters: "Do not knock back." Before Ethan could even begin wondering what those words meant, 3 slow knocks echoed from the opposite side of the door. Bang, bang, bang. Then, for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, someone called his name in the exact voice of his late mother, who had died more than 10 years earlier. "Ethan, please open the door. I'm so cold." Ethan felt every ounce of strength leave his body the moment he heard his mother's voice. It was perfect in every detail, carrying the same warmth, the same gentle tone, and even the slight pause she always made before saying his name. For one impossible second, he wanted to believe she was really there. His hand slowly reached toward the doorknob before the warning carved into the wood flashed through his mind: "Do not knock back." He pulled his hand away just as 3 more knocks echoed from the other side. Bang, bang, bang. The voice became desperate. "Ethan, please, let me in." Tears filled his eyes, but deep inside he knew it couldn't be real. His mother had died years ago. Whatever stood behind that door wasn't asking for help. It was asking for permission. Ethan stepped backward, shaking his head. "You're not my mother," he whispered. The hallway fell completely silent. Then the voice changed. It became deeper, older, colder. "Good," it replied. "You finally learned." Every light around him exploded in a shower of sparks, as the wooden door slowly dissolved into black dust. Behind it was not another room but an endless stone staircase descending into darkness. A freezing wind rushed upward, carrying the smell of wet earth and something far worse: decay. Ethan hesitated only a moment before descending, convinced that staying inside the shifting house would mean certain death. The staircase seemed endless. Hundreds of worn stone steps spiraled downward until he finally reached a vast underground chamber illuminated only by flickering candles. The walls were covered with thousands of names carved into the rock, some fresh, others almost erased by time. Ethan ran his fingers across one section and recognized several dates spanning more than 200 years. Every name ended the same way: missing. At the center of the chamber stood a giant circular well surrounded by old chains anchored into the stone floor. The chains stretched downward into complete darkness, gently rattling even though there was no wind. As Ethan approached, he heard something breathing far below. It was slow, deep, enormous. Suddenly a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. "Don't look down." Ethan spun around and saw an elderly man holding an old oil lantern. His beard was gray, his clothes were worn, and deep scars covered both of his hands. "Who are you?" Ethan asked. The old man looked at him with exhausted eyes. "My name is Samuel," he answered quietly. "I've been trapped here for 36 years. Ethan stared in disbelief. Samuel explained that he had answered the door when he was only 22 years old after hearing his younger brother crying outside. Ever since that night, the house had never allowed him to leave. Time flowed differently beneath Black Hollow. Days became years and years became decades. Many people who vanished from the town had never truly disappeared. They had simply become prisoners beneath it. Samuel pointed toward the giant well. "The thing below isn't the little girl," he whispered. "She's only the invitation." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, the chains surrounding the well suddenly became tight as though something unimaginably heavy had begun climbing upward from the darkness. The breathing grew louder. The stone floor trembled beneath their feet. One by one, the candles extinguished themselves until only Samuel's lantern remained. Then dozens of pale hands slowly reached over the edge of the well. They weren't climbing out. They were trying to hold something back. Hundreds of ghostly faces appeared behind the hands, all straining with desperate effort as though preventing an enormous force from escaping. Ethan recognized many of them from the photographs inside the house. Mothers, fathers, children, elderly couples. All the missing people from Black Hollow were there, silently fighting against whatever lived beneath them. Samuel grabbed Ethan's arm. "Listen carefully," he said. "The creature cannot cross into our world unless someone invites it. Every person who answers the door weakens the barrier. Every person who opens it allows another piece of it to escape." A thunderous roar erupted from the depths of the well, shaking the entire chamber. The pale spirits cried out together as the chains snapped one after another. Crack, crack, crack. Samuel's face filled with terror. "It's stronger than it's ever been." Suddenly the little girl appeared beside the well, smiling peacefully as if watching a beautiful sunrise. She looked directly at Ethan and softly asked, "Would you like to see who's knocking tonight?" Before he could answer, she pointed toward the darkness above. Somewhere far overhead, echoing through the tunnels beneath Black Hollow, came 3 slow knocks that seemed to shake the entire earth. Bang, bang, bang. Then thousands of terrified voices screamed all at once. The screams echoed through the underground chamber until they blended into one endless sound of terror. Ethan covered his ears, but it made no difference. The cries seemed to come from inside his own mind, as though every trapped soul beneath Black Hollow was trying to warn him at the same time. Above the well, the chains continued snapping one after another with deafening cracks, each broken link crashing against the stone floor. The ghostly hands clinging to the edge of the abyss began slipping, their desperate faces twisting with fear as the enormous force beneath them pushed upward. Samuel grabbed Ethan by the arm and pulled him toward a narrow tunnel hidden behind the ancient carvings. "We don't have much time," he shouted over the noise. "If it climbs out before sunrise, the curse won't belong only to Black Hollow anymore." They ran through the winding passage while the ground shook violently beneath their feet. The tunnel walls were lined with old candles that suddenly ignited by themselves as they passed, revealing hundreds of faded paintings covering the stone. Ethan slowed for a moment to look at them. The first painting showed a peaceful village standing where Black Hollow now existed centuries earlier. The next depicted frightened villagers gathered around a strange black doorway that had appeared in the forest after a violent storm. Another painting showed people opening that doorway out of curiosity, while a small girl in a white dress stood smiling nearby. The final paintings were far darker. Entire families disappeared. Houses stood abandoned. The forest filled with shadowy figures. At the center of the last mural, an enormous faceless creature rose from beneath the earth while countless people stretched out their hands toward it, as if they were trapped forever. Beneath the mural, someone had carved a warning into the stone. The first knock is curiosity. The second knock is permission. The third knock is forever. Ethan felt a chill race through his body as Samuel urged him onward. The tunnel eventually opened into an ancient circular chamber unlike anything Ethan had ever imagined. In its center stood a massive stone altar surrounded by 12 tall pillars. Each pillar was wrapped in rusted chains covered with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Samuel explained that long ago the founders of Black Hollow had managed to imprison the creature beneath the town, using an ancient ritual. The house above had never been haunted by ghosts. It had been built directly over the prison to hide the entrance forever. But over the generations people forgot the truth, dismissed the warnings as superstition, and continued answering the door whenever the mysterious knocking returned. Every curious visitor weakened the prison until only a few chains remained. As Samuel spoke, the symbols on the pillars suddenly began fading one by one. The first pillar cracked down the middle before collapsing into pieces. Then another. Then another. Each collapse echoed like thunder through the chamber. The little girl appeared once again, standing peacefully on top of the altar. This time she looked different. Her white dress had turned completely black, and the smile on her face was gone. She looked almost sad as she stared at Ethan. "You still don't understand," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." Ethan stared at her in confusion. "Then why are you doing this?" The girl slowly lowered her head. "Because I answered the door first." For a brief moment her appearance changed. Ethan no longer saw a monster. He saw an ordinary child, frightened and crying, reaching toward someone outside her home during a storm centuries earlier. Then the vision disappeared, replaced once again by the dark-eyed figure in the black dress. "Now I can never leave," she whispered, "unless someone takes my place." Before Ethan could respond, a deep roar erupted beneath the altar. The remaining pillars shattered simultaneously, sending clouds of dust into the air. The floor split open with a violent crack, revealing an endless abyss below. Two enormous glowing eyes slowly opened within the darkness. They were far larger than Ethan had imagined, each one the size of a house, staring upward without blinking. The air itself seemed to grow heavier as an impossibly large hand, covered in black smoke rather than flesh, slowly reached out of the abyss and wrapped its fingers around the edge of the broken altar. The creature was finally climbing out. Samuel closed his eyes in despair. "We've run out of time." At that exact moment, somewhere far above them, 3 slow knocks echoed once more through the silence. Bang, bang, bang. This time, someone else had answered. The sound of the third knock echoed through the collapsing underground prison like a sentence that could never be taken back. The instant someone above answered the door, the entire chamber trembled with terrifying force. Massive cracks raced across the stone walls, ancient pillars crumbled into dust, and the chains that had restrained the creature for centuries snapped one after another. The enormous hand of black smoke pulled itself farther out of the abyss, followed by a second hand even larger than the first. Ethan could feel an overwhelming presence pressing against his mind, as though simply looking at the creature was slowly stealing his memories. Faces from his childhood flashed before his eyes. His parents, his first school, his friends. They began fading one by one, replaced by endless darkness. Samuel grabbed Ethan and shouted, "Don't look into its eyes!" Ethan immediately lowered his head, but the damage had already begun. He struggled to remember why he had come to Black Hollow in the first place. The creature didn't merely consume people. It erased them. It removed every trace of who they had ever been until the world itself forgot they existed. The little girl stood silently beside the broken altar, tears running down her pale face. "Every person who answered the door became part of it," she whispered. "I was the first, but I wasn't the last." Suddenly the chamber filled with hundreds of glowing figures. The trapped souls Ethan had seen before surrounded the abyss, joining hands in one final attempt to hold the darkness back. Their expressions were no longer empty or frightening. They looked peaceful, determined, and ready to make one last sacrifice. Among them Ethan recognized parents protecting children, elderly couples standing together, and even strangers who smiled gently despite the terror surrounding them. Samuel stepped toward the spirits and nodded. "This is our only chance." Before Ethan could stop him, Samuel walked directly into the circle of light. His body slowly dissolved into thousands of glowing particles that flowed into the ancient symbols carved around the abyss. One by one, the other spirits did the same. Every sacrifice strengthened the fading seal for a few precious seconds. The enormous creature roared with such force that the entire mountain above seemed ready to collapse. Black smoke poured from the abyss, taking the shape of twisted arms reaching toward Ethan. He stumbled backward until he noticed something lying beside the shattered altar. It was the old silver cross the waitress had given him on his first day in Black Hollow. Somehow it had survived everything. As Ethan picked it up, the little girl looked at him with a sadness that no longer seemed evil. "If the heart is destroyed," she whispered, "I'll finally be free." She slowly pointed toward the center of the abyss where a faint crimson light pulsed beneath the endless darkness like a gigantic heartbeat. Boom! Ethan understood immediately. The creature's true heart was still hidden below, but reaching it would mean getting close enough to be pulled into the darkness forever. He took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the silver cross, and stepped toward the edge of the abyss while the remaining spirits held the creature back with every ounce of strength they had left. The heartbeat grew louder with each step until it shook his entire body. Just as Ethan prepared to leap, the creature stopped struggling. Everything became completely silent. Then a deep voice echoed from the darkness, sounding neither male nor female but impossibly ancient. "You could end this, or you could have everything you ever wanted." Instantly the darkness around Ethan transformed into beautiful visions. He saw his parents alive again, smiling proudly. He saw himself living a perfect life filled with happiness, success, and every dream he had ever imagined. The voices of his loved ones called his name, begging him to come home. For one dangerous moment, Ethan almost believed the illusion. Then he remembered the warning that had started everything. The creature never forced anyone inside. It only waited for someone to choose. Closing his eyes, Ethan whispered, "No more." He raised the silver cross high above his head and prepared to make the final decision that would determine not only his fate, but the fate of every soul the darkness had claimed for centuries. Ethan took one final breath and ignored the beautiful illusion surrounding him. The smiling faces of his parents slowly dissolved into black smoke, replaced once again by the endless abyss beneath the broken altar. The crimson heartbeat pulsed faster than ever before, shaking the ancient chamber with every beat. Without allowing himself another moment to hesitate, Ethan tightened his grip on the silver cross and leaped into the darkness. The instant he entered the abyss, icy shadows wrapped around his body, trying to pull him deeper into the endless void. Thousands of voices filled his mind, each one begging him to stop, promising him wealth, happiness, and a perfect life if he simply let go of the cross. Ethan closed his eyes and kept falling until he finally reached the source of the heartbeat. Suspended in the darkness was an enormous black heart surrounded by twisting shadows, beating with enough force to shake the entire underground world. Every beat sent waves of darkness across the chamber above, feeding the creature that had haunted Black Hollow for centuries. Ethan remembered every warning he had ignored, every victim who had answered the mysterious knock, and every sacrifice made to give him this one chance. With every ounce of strength he had left, he drove the silver cross into the center of the heart. For a single second, everything became completely silent. Then an earth-shattering scream echoed through the abyss, so powerful that it seemed to tear reality itself apart. Blinding white light burst from the heart as deep cracks spread across its surface. The enormous creature above let out one final roar before its body began dissolving into smoke. The darkness surrounding Ethan vanished instantly, replaced by warm sunlight pouring into the underground chamber. One by one, the trapped souls smiled peacefully before fading into the brilliant light. Samuel looked at Ethan one last time, nodded with gratitude and disappeared. The little girl stood alone beside the altar, no longer wearing a black dress. She looked like an ordinary child once again. Tears filled her eyes as she smiled gently and whispered, "Thank you for opening the right door." Her body slowly became countless glowing lights that floated upward before disappearing forever. Moments later, the entire underground prison collapsed. Ethan barely managed to climb back to the surface as the ancient tunnels sealed themselves beneath the earth forever. When morning arrived, Black Hollow looked completely different. The heavy fog had disappeared. The forest felt alive again. Birds sang through the trees, children laughed in the streets, and for the first time the town felt truly peaceful. No one remembered the curse. The abandoned Ashcroft house had vanished completely, replaced by an empty field covered with wildflowers, as though the house had never existed at all. Ethan quietly packed his belongings and left Black Hollow without telling anyone what had happened beneath the town. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The nightmares became less frequent, and Ethan convinced himself the horror was finally over. Then, exactly 1 year later, he woke suddenly in the middle of the night after hearing a familiar sound. Bang, bang, bang. His heart stopped. He slowly turned toward the clock beside his bed. 3 a.m. The room was silent except for the gentle knocking at his apartment door. Ethan remained perfectly still. The knocking came again. Bang, bang, bang. Then a soft voice called his name from the hallway. It sounded frightened. Sounded human. It sounded real. Ethan closed his eyes and remembered everything he had survived. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not answer. After several long minutes, the knocking stopped. Dawn eventually arrived and sunlight filled the room. Ethan carefully opened the front door. No one was there. Only a small piece of paper rested on the welcome mat. Written in faded black ink were 6 simple words. "You finally learned not to answer." Ethan smiled quietly, closed the door and walked away, knowing that some doors should never be opened, no matter how desperate the voice on the other side may sound. Thank you so much for listening to this terrifying story. We hope you enjoyed every chilling moment while improving your English through storytelling. If you like this video, please give it a like, leave a comment telling us which part scared you the most, and don't forget to subscribe to English Spark for more horror stories, English listening practice, and unforgettable adventures. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Until next time, sleep well, keep learning English, and if you ever hear 3 slow knocks at exactly 3 a.m., remember the warning, don't answer the door.